At 2300 hours on November 19th, 1943, less than 12 hours before the first Marine would step into the surf at Tarawa, 9 American sailors slid silently into black water so dark they could not tell where the ocean ended and the sky began. The island of Betio lay ahead of them, just a thin line of palm silhouettes against faint haze. But beneath those palms hid 4,500 Japanese soldiers, armed to the teeth, confident that any American foolish enough to attack their fortress would die on the reef long before reaching the sand. Tarawa was small, barely 2 miles long and less than 1,000 yards wide, but it bristled with reinforced bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, minefields, barbed wire, and artillery batteries that could pulverize anything afloat. The Japanese garrison believed this place was impenetrable, a perfect trap where waves of Marines would bleed to death against coral and concrete. And to be fair, many American planners feared that exact outcome. Intelligence suggested that the entire southern shoreline was protected by a razor-sharp coral shelf, a natural barrier just below the surface that could rip open the bottom of landing craft or leave them stranded hundreds of yards from the beach. If that happened, Marines would have to wade forward under machine gun fire so intense that casualty estimates predicted half the first assault wave could be killed before their boots even touched sand. General Holland Smith wanted answers, not guesses. He needed someone who could swim into enemy waters unseen, measure tide depths and obstacles by hand, and return with the truth. That responsibility fell to Lieutenant Thomas Tex James, a 27-year-old hydrographic specialist and former competitive swimmer who understood that the first Battle of Tarawa would not be fought on land. It would be fought in the dark sea, under Japanese guns. His 8 teammates were just as skilled and just as determined. They carried no guns, only swim fins, bamboo depth poles, waterproof charts, luminous compasses, and a determined belief that the success of the invasion and the lives of thousands of Marines depended entirely on the measurements they brought back. The rubber boats carrying them scraped quietly across the coral ledge. James signaled stop. This was as far as they dared approach on the surface. The men slid over the sides and let the warm Pacific water swallow them up to their necks. The current pulled and twisted at their legs as they began their slow, careful swim toward shore, feeling through the darkness for jagged coral under the surface. Every few strokes, the lead swimmer drove his pole downward until the tip struck something solid, then lifted the pole above the water to mark the depth under faint starlight, and quietly scratched that number on the chart. The silence was suffocating. They could hear distant Japanese voices drifting over the water, boots moving inside bunkers, and sometimes the metallic clink of equipment being loaded or adjusted for the coming slaughter. Searchlights swept the lagoon with wide white arcs that reflected sharply off the wave crests. Each time a beam came close, the swimmers pressed themselves flat against the coral, barely daring to breathe. Foot by foot, yard by yard, they mapped the unseen battlefield. The numbers they recorded were not encouraging. The water was shallow, far too shallow for landing craft to glide over at low tide. James's worst fear began to take shape. Marines might be forced to exit their boats hundreds of yards from land and move across open water on foot while machine guns shredded anything that moved. As they swam closer, the bunkers above them became clearer. Massive concrete shapes rising out of the beach like dark teeth pointed toward the lagoon. If even one swimmer splashed too loudly or reflected a glint of light, Japanese gunners would unleash a barrage that would erase the entire team from history. By 01:45 hours, James had reached a position so close to the beach he could make out individual guards putting out cigarettes and stacking fresh ammunition belts beside their guns. He smelled smoke from their cooking fires and heard one man cough just above his head. He planted his depth pole again, marked another measurement, and realized the water here was barely waist deep. If the tide dropped even 6 inches lower, landing craft would not stand a chance. He gave the signal. The mapping was complete. They needed to escape while darkness still hid their movements. The return swim was twice as brutal. Waves slammed the men against coral, tearing skin from their legs and hands. One chart nearly slipped from its case as the current dragged it sideways. The hours crawled by in punishing silence, every muscle burning from effort and fear. If they were discovered, there would be no rescue, no extraction, no burial. Only blood in the water, and a mystery for commanders to puzzle over once the shooting stopped. At 0350 hours, exhausted and shaking from adrenaline and near hypothermia, the 9 swimmers climbed back aboard their ship. Lieutenant James staggered into the command room and laid his soaked chart on the table in front of General Julian Smith. The truth stared back in black pencil and blue ink. There was no safe water. There was no easy approach. Marines would land into hell. James wrote a final note across the bottom of the paper before collapsing into a chair. Recommend tracked landing vehicles to lead. All infantry prepare to wade. The general said nothing at first. He simply stared at the map, knowing that this intelligence would save thousands of lives and doom hundreds more. Because although planners now understood the danger, there was no alternative. The assault would go forward. Marines would fight through that shallow reef, and many would never make it out of the water alive. But without the 9 men who swam into darkness, the disaster could have been total. They stole the island's most closely guarded secret and delivered it just in time. The battle for Tarawa would begin in a few hours. When the sun rose, the ocean would run red, and those depth numbers would decide who lived long enough to reach the sand. Lieutenant James had delivered the warning, but warnings did not stop wars. The Marine invasion force was already loading equipment, checking rifles, sharpening bayonets, and steeling themselves for the most violent beach landing the Pacific had seen so far. War planners understood the grim prediction. The first wave would take massive casualties, but the momentum of assault could not be slowed by fear. James and his team were ordered to rest, but none of them slept. Their bodies ached from salt cuts and bruised ribs, yet every man lay awake staring at the ceiling of the troop compartment, imagining the fight that would erupt when dawn hit the lagoon. They could hear Marines joking in nervous tones, pretending to be confident as they checked gear and passed around cigarettes. Even the bravest men felt the tightening in the gut that came before a landing. Tarawa had a reputation forming around it, a place the Japanese boasted no one could take. One of the swimmers, Seaman Jack Williams, finally sat upright from his cot. He had spent 2 hours replaying the mission in his mind, remembering how close they came to disaster when the searchlight had skimmed across the waves. He thought of his younger brother already serving with the 2nd Marine Division. Williams knew that if the water dropped lower than predicted, the first wave, including his own brother, might never reach the beach. He stood quietly, walked the narrow aisle between bunks, and stepped outside onto the deck. He looked toward the coast, but all he saw was darkness and the faint impression of palms. Somewhere out there, thousands of Japanese soldiers were waiting, rifles loaded, machine guns sighted, range cards pre-printed. On that same beach, at this very moment, officers walked from bunker to bunker, preparing their men to fight to the death for the Emperor. At 0400, red lights blinked on the transport ship's lower decks. Marines were to assemble for breakfast and final briefing. The boats would be lowered at 0600. By 0830, the first wave would cross the lagoon. The men ate without taste, barely aware of the food on their trays. Some stared into metal cups of coffee, wondering if this would be their last warm drink. Others made promises aloud to no one in particular. Promises to write their mothers. Promises to survive at least long enough to get off the beach. Below deck, commanders pored over James's tide predictions. There were no illusions now. The coral shelf would catch landing craft, and when it did, men would die in the water. The only question was how quickly reinforcements could exploit any breakthrough. General Julian Smith stood over the map table with a fixed expression. He had commanded Marines for years, but Betio was different. The intelligence reports described a Japanese defensive layout as tight and murderous as anything seen in Europe's most fortified ports. Pillboxes were reinforced with layers of steel, coconut logs, and concrete so thick that only direct hits from naval artillery could break them open. Anti-boat obstacles were placed at precisely the depth where landing craft needed to pass. Mortars were stationed behind every dune. The entire island was one interconnected kill zone. And now, thanks to the 9 swimmers, He knew that Marines would face all of that while dragging water-soaked gear, tripping on coral heads, and pushing through waves that slowed every step. He looked down at the maps again, then straightened his uniform and made his decision. The invasion would not change. The cost would simply be accepted. As the sun began to rise, the vast armada around Tarawa took on shape. Destroyers, battleships, transport ships, and rows upon rows of amphibious tractors churning the water. Lieutenant James stood alongside his team on their deck, watching Marines climb down cargo nets into waiting craft, each man loaded with packs that suddenly looked far too heavy for a 600-yard march through the sea. The thunder started at 0542 hours. Every ship with a gun opened fire. Battleships hurled 16-inch shells that smashed into the island, with explosions so violent they shook the decks of vessels half a mile away. Destroyers unleashed streams of high-velocity fire that ripped apart anything above ground. The beach disappeared under towering clouds of sand, smoke, and flame. Palm trees erupted like torches. Bunkers vanished into expanding craters. The bombardment thundered non-stop for 76 minutes. When the guns finally fell silent, every Marine watching believed nothing human could still be alive on that beach. That was the moment Japanese Colonel Shibasaki had planned for from the beginning. Nearly all his troops were underground, reinforced, protected. The bombardment had done damage, but not nearly enough. His men rolled aside armored doors, cleared ventilation shafts, and mounted their guns. They were ready. 0900 hours. The first wave crossed the lagoon. The coral reef lay exactly where Lieutenant James told them it would. Landing craft ground to a halt, trapped in shallow water, unable to move. Infantry poured over the sides and into chest-deep surf. They pushed forward as machine gun bullets began snapping off the surface like hailstones. Mortars exploded around them, spraying shrapnel through flesh and bone. Marines screamed for corpsmen, many collapsing backward into the tide and disappearing beneath water that turned red almost instantly. Lieutenant James and his swimmers watched from the deck in silent horror. They saw men fall before taking 10 steps. They saw entire squads pinned down in waist-deep water with nowhere to hide. They saw the reef claim exactly what the charts predicted. They also saw bravery on a level few could comprehend. Marines dropped their packs to move faster. They formed ad hoc groups and rushed forward, firing from the hip while bullets slashed past their faces. Some used bodies for cover. Friends, strangers, anything that could stop a round. Amphibious tractors, the LVTS James had recommended, became floating shields that carried wounded men forward and returned for more. Those tracked vehicles were never meant for repeated shuttles, but the drivers refused to stop, turning themselves into targets to save others. By late morning, a small cluster of Marines had reached the seawall and clung to it like survivors from a shipwreck. They could not advance. They could not retreat. The lagoon behind them was littered with dead and dying. Japanese machine guns fired so precisely that medics who tried to help wounded men a few feet away were killed instantly. James clenched his jaw as he watched. The numbers on his chart had come to life in the worst possible way. But he also understood something else. Without that chart, without those measurements, the assault might have been timed differently, tides misjudged, and the casualties would be tenfold. The invasion force might have broken, retreated, and lost the initiative. A failure at Tarawa would have delayed the drive across the Pacific and cost far more lives in the long run. Still, watching Marines drown in shallow water was a burden he would carry for the rest of his life. As long as he lived, he would remember every stroke of his pole in the darkness and every number he wrote, because each one became a Marine who struggled through surf and blood while Japanese defenders poured fire down onto them without mercy. The battle for Tarawa had begun exactly as everyone feared, and yet the swimmers knew something else. Their mission was not finished. There would be more tides to measure, more obstacles to mark, and more lives to save through knowledge won in the most dangerous waters on Earth. But first, the Marines on the beach had to survive. By nightfall on November 20th, the situation remained precarious. The Marines who had clawed their way to the seawall were alive only because the tide had hidden their movement during the worst of the killing. But they were pinned, low on ammunition, dehydrated after hours in salt water, and surrounded by wounded, whose cries echoed up and down the beach long after the sun set over the Pacific. No reinforcements had reached them. Most of the second wave suffered the same fate as the first. Trapped on the reef, gunned down in the lagoon, or forced to hide behind corpses and sand mounds only a few inches tall. The landing plan had fractured into isolated pockets of resistance, each group fighting its own private battle for survival. From the deck of the transport ship, Lieutenant James monitored radio traffic that sounded more like chaos than combat. Commanders were dead, units were shattered. The Marines on Red Beach 2 had almost no communication with those on Red Beach 1. In some places, a handful of men advanced, only to be cut down before reaching the first bunker. Across the lagoon, Japanese flares illuminated the carnage like cruel searchlights. James had never felt so helpless. His team had delivered vital intelligence, but now they could only watch as Marines paid the price of the reef with blood. Many in the landing force were barely 18, fresh out of training, thrown directly into the most brutal amphibious assault of the Pacific War. The Japanese fought with the full conviction that surrender was worse than death, and they fired on anything that moved: swimmers, stretcher parties, even wounded men waving white cloth. By midnight, the water around Tarawa was thick with corpses drifting gently in the current. James stood alone at the rail, gripping the cold metal so hard his knuckles turned white. He tried to convince himself that their reconnaissance had ultimately saved lives, that the landing would have been a complete disaster if commanders had believed the water deeper than it was. But the screams carried across the water told him that even the truth had come at a terrible cost. Around 0030 hours, a message arrived from shore. Marines had carved out a thin, fragile foothold, a strip of sand and shattered concrete barely 50 yards deep. They needed artillery support, but naval fire risked hitting their own men. Japanese spotters still held positions with clear views of the lagoon and the beach. Headquarters needed updated information, urgently. How many bunkers were still active? Where were Japanese machine gun nests adjusting their aim? Where could LVTS safely approach under cover of darkness? Only one group of men could answer those questions. James didn't hesitate. He ordered his team to gear up. Salt and blood still crusted in the cuts on their legs. Their muscles felt like lead from the previous night. But they strapped on fins, checked their maps, and loaded fresh grease pencils into waterproof bags. They did not speak. They understood the stakes without words. At 0130 hours on November 21st, the 9 swimmers slipped into the waves once again, heading directly toward an island where Marines were dying only hundreds of yards from their targets. The current was stronger than the previous night, pulling them diagonally across the lagoon. James led from the front, reading the faint glow of his compass beneath the waves. Behind him, Seaman Williams swam hard to keep pace, thoughts of his brother driving every kick. The other swimmers struggled to remain silent as salt water forced its way into their throats. This time, the Japanese were fully alert. The night sky flashed with red tracer fire as defenders fired blindly at shadows near the reef. Mortar shells thumped in the distance, followed seconds later by the splash of violent impact. Sometimes the swimmers could feel shockwaves push against their chests underwater, and still they moved forward. As they neared the seawall, they saw what daylight had hidden. Hundreds of fallen Marines tangled in shell craters, collapsed against logs, or drifting face down where the surf had caught them. The sight forced every swimmer to confront the reality of their mission. These men had died crossing terrain the swimmers had mapped with careful marks only 24 hours earlier. The truth was no longer lines on a chart. It was death in the water. James signaled the team to spread out and begin their work. They no longer needed to measure depth. They had done that. Tonight was about finding safe approaches, identifying Japanese firing points, and confirming potential breach locations. They swam parallel to the beach, stopping often to study the silhouettes of bunkers and the flashes of gun barrels hidden among the ruins. Williams drifted closer to shore than intended and felt his fins scrape against metal. He reached down and touched cold steel, a sunken LVT riddled with bullet holes. Several Marines lay half-submerged around it, their equipment still strapped to their bodies. Williams forced himself to keep moving. Hesitation could kill all 9 of them. They worked quickly, making detailed marks on their charts despite the constant threat of detection. Every bunker location mattered. Every artillery position mattered. One mistake could condemn an entire battalion at sunrise. Suddenly, a flare burst overhead, bright as a miniature sun. The lagoon lit up like midday. James flattened himself against a coral lump, barely big enough to cover his torso. Machine gun fire raked across the water around them. One swimmer swallowed a cry as a bullet sliced fabric from his shoulder and grazed skin. He held his position as warm blood mixed with seawater. The flare burned out. Darkness returned. The machine guns paused. James made a silent decision. They had enough. He signaled retreat. One by one, the men turned and began the grueling swim back through water that now carried the metallic taste of fear. As they distanced themselves from the beach, Williams paused. He turned his head toward the island and stared into the void. He knew his brother might be one of the voices calling for medics, or he might already be gone. So many Americans were trapped along the seawall, waiting for a miracle. Williams clenched his jaw, then resumed swimming, knowing that the information they carried could create that miracle. When they reached the transport at 03:15 hours, James climbed aboard and headed straight to the command room. He unfolded the soaked map and updated bunker coordinates with precise marks. They had identified 2 potential breaches in the seawall and 3 hidden machine gun nests that were tearing through the left flank. Naval artillery would strike those positions at dawn, clearing a path for a renewed push. This time, the swimmers didn't wait to collapse from exhaustion. They headed straight to the showers to wash blood-tinged salt water from their wounds, then sat shoulder to shoulder on a bench, staring into nothing as Marine officers shouted orders and the assault plans shifted into motion. Their mission had once again changed the battle. When the second day of fighting began, naval guns targeted exactly the positions the swimmers had identified. Marines pushed through gaps in the seawall and finally advanced inland, using destroyed bunkers as stepping stones in a landscape that had turned from paradise into a cemetery. Progress was measured one burning structure at a time. The Japanese counterattacked again and again, but the beachhead expanded. More Marines reached land. Ammunition flowed forward. Machine guns fell silent under hand grenades and flamethrowers. The foothold was no longer just a line in the sand. It was a wedge driven straight into the heart of Betio. And while the battle raged, the 9 swimmers lay awake, knowing dawn would demand more from them before Tarawa was finally taken. By the evening of November 21st, Marines had pushed inland far enough to reach the first line of Japanese command bunkers, but the victory came at a terrifying cost. Many of the units leading the assault were operating at half strength or worse. Company commanders were dead. Radio operators had been wiped out by snipers who targeted the men with antennas before anyone else. Casualty reports were a blur of numbers and missing names, and no one on the island knew for certain how many Marines were still alive in the center of Betio. Intelligence became the most valuable resource of the battle. The Japanese still controlled much of the shoreline, including the long wooden pier jutting into the lagoon. The same pier the swimmers had passed the night before. That pier hid bunkers beneath its struts, concealed snipers among its twisted supports, and provided enemy spotters with a clear view of every LVT approaching from the reef. Marines who tried to use it for cover found themselves caught in crossfire from both sides. At 1800 hours, a message reached the transport ships. Commanders needed detailed reconnaissance of the pier structure before the next wave of reinforcements approached under darkness. No one knew where the supporting bunkers were located or how many snipers operated underneath. If supplies moved in blindly, they risked ending up in a killing corridor. Once again, Lieutenant James and his team prepared to enter the water. Their bodies were nearly at their limit. Salt burns covered their ankles and thighs. Coral cuts had begun to swell and throb with infection. Every breath felt heavier than the last. But none of that mattered. If Marines could not be resupplied, they could not advance. And if they could not advance, the entire invasion risked collapsing into the lagoon. The 9 swimmers entered the water at 19:30 hours. The tide had begun to rise, making the approach more hazardous. The water was deeper now, and currents swirled unpredictably around the coral ridges. The sky remained overcast, with low storm clouds threatening rain. Lightning flickered on the far horizon, a silent warning that nature might turn hostile at any moment. As they swam, James could see sharp muzzle flashes from Japanese guns firing inland. Each flash illuminated the hulls of wrecked landing craft and bodies still floating in the black waves. He felt a persistent fear pressing into him. The fear that if they failed tonight, Marines would die simply trying to bring ammunition to the front. The pier loomed larger with every stroke. Wooden support beams glistened with salt spray. The structure extended like a skeletal finger pointing into the sea, and beneath it lurked shadows that might hide dozens of Japanese riflemen. James signaled silence and guided his team beneath the wooden planks. They could no longer swim freely. Now they had to crawl along submerged beams to avoid creating ripples visible from above. Marine corpses bobbed against the supports, pushed by the tide like broken dolls. The swimmers pushed them gently aside, knowing that noise was deadlier than sentiment. Halfway down the pier, James heard something above. Footsteps. He froze, one hand pressed against the wet timber, listening. A pair of Japanese soldiers were walking the length of the structure, stopping periodically to look down into the water. One carried a flashlight. The beam shot downward, scattering patterns of white light that danced inches from the swimmers' faces. The Japanese soldier paused when he saw movement below. James stopped breathing. The flashlight beam hovered just above his shoulders, seconds from revealing the entire mission. Then the soldier stepped back, muttered something to his companion, and moved on. James exhaled only when he heard the footsteps fade into the storm-washed wind. The team reached the pier's midpoint and began taking measurements and sketching the location of each supporting pillar. They identified machine gun ports built into the reef near the pier's end, cleverly camouflaged concrete nests capable of firing directly into the path of incoming LVTS. That information alone was worth the risk. Seaman Williams quietly counted the number of rifles stacked just above the beams. He saw ammunition crates piled in the shadows, evidence that the Japanese planned to reinforce the pier heavily if the Marines gained significant ground inland. Williams noted each observation with quick strokes of his pencil. Then came the worst moment of the night. A Japanese patrol descended a ladder into the lower supports, their boots scraping along timber as they checked positions under the pier. The swimmers were trapped, pinned between vertical wooden beams and rising water. There was no room to swim away, no coral mound to hide behind. James pushed himself deeper beneath the slats, fully submerging, relying on the pitch-black water to conceal him. His lungs screamed as he held still. He could hear the Japanese voices above his head, the guttural cadence of men debating whether to keep searching. If they stayed even 10 seconds longer, the swimmers would need to surface for air right into their lights. Lightning cracked somewhere distant. Thunder rolled over the lagoon. The patrol finally climbed upward again and disappeared. James surfaced behind one of the beams, gulping air so quietly it was almost painful. He looked to his left and right, confirming all 8 men were still with him. None had panicked. None had fled. They had risked suffocation rather than reveal themselves. That resolve kept the mission alive. They completed their sketches just as the storm reached the island, sending sheets of rain across the water. The downpour masked their exit. It also churned waves into a violent mess that nearly swept them into the pilings. Salt stung their eyes. Thunder drowned out the sound of their fins. The ocean felt like a living force trying to kill them. The swim back took nearly an hour longer than expected. Twice Williams lost sight of the team and had to guess his direction by the faint glow of distant shell fire. Every stroke felt like swimming through acid, but the fear of losing their hard-won intelligence drove them onward. When they finally reached their transport, officers rushed them inside. Their charts were immediately placed under lamps. Captains leaned over the drawings with urgent eyes. One officer clapped James on the shoulder and whispered, "This will save lives in the next hour, Lieutenant. More than you know." But James barely heard him. His thoughts had drifted again to the men trapped under the pier, Marines soaked in seawater and blood, waiting for relief or death while he stood warm and breathing aboard a ship. He walked away from the map table and sat heavily against the bulkhead, staring at his hands. They trembled painfully, the nerves overwhelmed by exhaustion and adrenaline. He tried to close his eyes, but every time he blinked, he saw the flashlight beams sweeping across the water, inches from exposing them. He reminded himself that they had made it back. They had done their job. He had 8 men alive because they had followed him. 8 men whose courage tonight meant ammunition and medical supplies could reach the beach without being massacred on approach. But the fear lingered. Fear that at some point their luck would run out. The rain intensified outside as Japanese artillery continued pounding the shoreline. Marines on Betio braced for another night with the enemy only yards away. The swimmers washed salt water from their cuts once again and tried to stay awake long enough to hear whether their charts had made a difference. The storm would break by dawn, and when it did, the final day of Tarawa would begin. Dawn broke on November 22nd with a grim gray light filtering through low clouds, illuminating a battlefield that barely resembled land. Entire sections of the island were flattened into smoking ruins. Coconut palms lay snapped and splintered like matchsticks. Pools of seawater collected in bomb craters, where Marines and Japanese soldiers lay side by side, neither side willing or able to move their dead. But the American foothold had strengthened. Marines pushed deeper inland, using flamethrowers and demolition charges to clear out bunkers one chamber at a time. The air reeked of burning timber, melted steel, and something far worse: the thick, nauseating smell of death lingering in every gust of wind. Machine guns barked from shattered pillboxes while grenades detonated inside dark tunnels at point-blank range. It was a battle measured in feet, not yards. While the Marines advanced under fire, the 9 swimmers stood ready on the transport deck, awaiting new orders. Their charts had already guided engineers to place temporary markers showing supply lanes safe from Japanese gunners under the pier. Ammunition and water began to reach the beach with fewer casualties. The foothold widened. The Marines gained breathing room. Barely. Shortly after 0900 hours, radio intelligence identified the probable location of Colonel Shibasaki's command post, a heavily fortified bunker dug into the island's center, protected by overlapping trenches and machine gun nests. Destroying that bunker would break the spine of the Japanese defense. Naval artillery was requested, but the position was too close to friendly troops. Command needed precise coordinates to direct fire without killing Marines, who were only a few dozen yards away. The battle hinged on locating that bunker accurately. For the 4th time in less than 40 hours, Lieutenant James and his swimmers were called forward. They entered the lagoon once more, this time with an escort, a single LVT that would act as a mobile extraction platform if they were detected. They swam directly toward the center of Betio, using smoke from burning bunkers as concealment. The water tasted of ash. As they neared the seawall, they passed Marines crouched behind debris, exchanging fire with Japanese riflemen only 20 yards away. One Marine waved them forward, his left arm wrapped in a blood-soaked bandage. He didn't seem surprised to see swimmers in the middle of a land battle. On Tarawa, nothing surprised anyone anymore. The swimmers slipped through a breach in the seawall and belly-crawled through shell craters filled with warm, murky water. Japanese bullets cracked overhead. The ground shook from nearby explosions. The island was so narrow that no matter where they were, they could hear someone fighting for life close by. James spotted a network of fresh trenches, narrow channels carved through the coral sand with meticulous precision. Marines had not reached them yet. That meant this was the route Japanese runners used to deliver orders, ammunition, and reinforcements between bunkers still holding the line. He signaled the team to follow. As they crawled deeper, they heard voices. Japanese radio operators speaking rapidly inside a reinforced underground bunker. That had to be Shibasaki's post. Every instinct told James this was the center of the enemy's command. But they needed to be sure. Williams pulled out a mirror and angled it carefully around the corner. He saw two heavily armed guards stationed beside a concealed entrance. One wore an officer's sword. The other manned a tripod-mounted machine gun. Boxes of ammunition surrounded them. The bunker was clearly still active. James sketched the position quickly, marking angles and distances with exact measurements. He knew Marine artillery officers would fire based on these lines alone. A single miscalculation could obliterate Americans advancing from the opposite direction. Before he could finish, a Japanese soldier ran down the trench directly toward them, a young officer clutching a field telephone. He sprinted past the corner where James and two swimmers lay pressed into a puddle of mud. The officer was so focused on the bunker that he never looked down. James waited for him to exit the trench before signaling retreat. They slipped away through the most chaotic battlefield any of them had ever seen, moving faster than they had in the water, because the stakes now felt even higher. If they died here, their intelligence died with them, and Marines might die blind. A sniper shot cracked past them, kicking dust into their faces. Another bullet sparked off coral, inches from Williams' elbow. They didn't look back. They crawled to the seawall, dove into the surf, and swam as fast as weary arms could carry them. When they reached the LVT, the crew pulled them aboard while waves crashed against the hull. Within 20 minutes, they were back on the transport, dripping salt and sweat onto the bridge deck, placing updated maps in the hands of commanders who surrounded them with instant urgency. James pointed to the reinforced bunker. "This is your target." At 10:15 hours, U.S. destroyers fired a precise barrage directly on the coordinates. The ground shook like a volcanic eruption. The bunker roof collapsed inward. Secondary explosions rippled outward as munitions inside ignited. Marine infantry advanced within minutes. They found the shattered remains of the Japanese command center and dozens of enemy officers crushed beneath concrete sagging into ash-filled chambers. Among the bodies lay Colonel Shibasaki. The architect of the Tarawa defenses was dead. The Japanese defense began to fall apart. One by one, bunkers went silent. Marines breached trenches and seized positions that had blocked the advance for nearly 2 days. The American perimeter expanded from a fragile strip of beach into a dominant foothold, cutting the island in half. Survivors from the seawall, many still soaked in brine and coated in sand, surged forward with newfound purpose. The nightmare crossing of the lagoon was finally behind them. Now they were fighting face to face and winning. By late afternoon, the last major strongpoint on Betio had been overrun. Resistance continued in isolated pockets, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Tarawa was falling. Only then did Williams finally get word about his brother. A corpsman who had worked the southern sector recognized his name and approached with a solemn look. He told Williams that his brother had been hit crossing the reef during the first wave. He had fought his way to the seawall but died there before medics could reach him. They had marked his body for recovery once the beach was secure. Williams stared at the corpsman without speaking. He nodded only once. His brother had made the beach. He had reached the island that everyone said Americans could never take. That felt like its own kind of victory, and Williams clung to it because the alternative was too painful to face. The swimmers didn't celebrate. They didn't cheer. They stood silently along the deck railing, watching Marines push the remaining defenders toward the island's western tip, under a sky blackened by smoke. They had swum through blood and fear to map a lagoon full of death. They had watched thousands of Marines sacrifice everything to gain less than a mile of sand. They had delivered intelligence that shaped the battle's outcome. But at a cost they would carry forever. Tarawa was nearly secured, but their mission wasn't over yet. As night settled again over Betio on November 22nd, the last pockets of Japanese resistance fell back toward the western end of the island. They no longer coordinated their defense through command channels. Those officers were dead beneath collapsed concrete. Instead, Marines faced individual acts of defiance. Wounded riflemen firing from rubble, snipers hidden in palm roots, lone machine gunners determined to take as many Americans as possible with them into death. No one on the ground believed the battle was over. Not yet! Inside half-ruined bunkers, Marines and Japanese soldiers fought each other in choking darkness, where flashlights revealed only brief, frozen glimpses of terrified faces before shadows swallowed everything again. Some fights were decided by grenades tossed blindly down corridors. Others were decided by bayonets when weapons jammed in the humidity and grime. In one shattered pillbox, Marines found a Japanese defender sitting cross-legged among spent casings, his hands still clamped around a machine gun that had fired until its barrel glowed red. He was dead, but his expression carried the fury of a man who refused to yield even after life left him. That was the enemy the swimmers had faced in the waves, unseen, but relentless. By midnight, organized resistance existed only in the farthest corner of the island. Marines prepared to launch a final coordinated push at dawn, but once again intelligence was needed. No one knew how many defenders remained or what they were armed with. Ammunition shortages among surviving Marines made reckless advances impossible. Before anyone spoke the request aloud, Lieutenant James anticipated it. He gathered his 8 exhausted men and told them they were going one more time, one more swim, one more silent run beneath the guns, one more chance to prevent a final ambush that could claim hundreds of lives at the very end. There were no questions, no hesitation. They entered the lagoon around 0200 hours, pushing through water that smelled of smoke and gunpowder. The moon finally broke through clouds, illuminating debris floating between them. Helmets, rifles, broken crates, and the silent shapes of those who never reached the beach. The reef had become a graveyard. They swam farther west than before, angling toward a narrow point of the island that jutted into the sea. This was the last defensive stronghold, a cluster of bunkers carved into coral ledges so hard that even naval guns had only cracked the edges. Intelligence suggested surviving Japanese officers had gathered there for a final stand. James halted the team behind a half-sunken timber and scanned the shoreline. Fires burned low along the beach, giving the horizon a faint orange glow. Through that flickering haze, he saw movement, figures running between trenches and crawling into firing pits as if preparing for a counterattack. Even now, at their final breath, the defenders were ready to fight. James counted positions, traced trench angles, and marked every active bunker he could spot. He needed to know how many Marines could be ambushed in one burst of fire. He needed to know where the last killing zones were hidden. He needed to know how to end this quickly. The swimmers advanced closer, crawling over coral that sliced through their fatigues. One man caught his fin on a steel spike planted in the lagoon and nearly cried out as the jagged metal cut deep into his calf. The blood clouded instantly, but the tide pulled it away before sharks could scent it. James reached shallow water and pressed himself into the sand behind a row of torn-up logs that once served as a defensive barrier. From here he could clearly hear Japanese officers shouting instructions, not panicked, but controlled, determined. They still believed they could kill Americans in numbers large enough to matter. He knew the Japanese plan now. They were preparing a last-ditch assault at dawn, a banzai charge that would hurl every surviving defender directly at Marine lines in one final suicidal rush. If that charge hit with surprise, the cost could be catastrophic. James wrote rapid notes marking where the charge would emerge and how far it was positioned behind friendly lines. He signaled withdrawal. They would take this intelligence back and give Marines the chance to survive sunrise. As they swam back through calm water, the sky began to lighten behind them. First a strip of pale silver, then hints of gold, then the deep red of dawn, the same color that had covered the lagoon when Marines first stepped into the surf. The swimmers reached the transport, climbed aboard with the last of their strength, and handed over their charts. Those drawings triggered a rapid series of orders. Machine gun squads shifted into fresh positions. Mortar crews adjusted their aim. Marines who had spent 2 days pinned to the sand now stood with rifles loaded, watching the horizon where the swimmers pointed. At 0445 hours on November 23rd, just before the sun rose, the Japanese launched their final attack. Hundreds of soldiers stormed forward screaming, "Tenno Heika Banzai!" Long live the Emperor! As they charged down the narrow western tongue of Betio, they expected to catch Americans off guard. They expected to overwhelm the front line before Marines could react. Instead, they charged directly into prepared kill zones. Machine guns opened first, ripping long, deadly lines through the charging masses. Mortars fell among them, scattering bodies and turning momentum into chaos. Riflemen held steady and fired calmly, one shot after another, knowing every bullet could prevent another Marine from dying. The Banzai charge lasted less than 30 minutes. When it ended, the battlefield fell silent apart from the crackling of flames and the distant wash of the tide against coral. The Battle of Tarawa was over, all objectives secured. No more Japanese soldiers capable of fighting, no more attacks coming from the darkness. There would be cleanup operations, prisoner searches, and grim work retrieving the fallen. But the island was now in American hands. The Marines had taken the place the Japanese said could never be taken. Betio, conquered. James and his team finally disembarked onto the island later that morning. The air was thick and hot, filled with the sour smell of scorched flesh from the flamethrowers that had cleared bunker after bunker. Sand stuck to their legs where dried salt water clung like glue. They felt every step through cuts that had barely clotted over. Williams wasn't ready, but he needed to see his brother. A young Marine private led him to a row of covered bodies laid respectfully side by side near the seawall. Williams stopped when the private pointed to one particular shape, a Marine whose uniform was soaked and torn along the sleeves, whose dog tags hung neatly over a still chest. Williams removed his cap and bowed his head. He knelt beside his brother and placed one hand gently on the faded fabric of his uniform. There were no grand gestures, no speeches, just a moment between two siblings, one living, one gone, bound forever by a battlefield only a few miles wide. James stood several feet behind, giving him the privacy he deserved. He said nothing. There were no words for grief earned with such violence. Tarawa had been taken. But victory did not feel like triumph. It felt like survival, barely. The sun climbed higher over Betio on November 23rd, revealing the full measure of the battle that had raged across this small strip of sand. Marines moved slowly among the ruins, searching for survivors, collecting equipment, and doing the solemn work of identifying their dead. Every step kicked up ash. Every breath tasted of gunpowder. The lagoon surface, once bright turquoise, was darkened by oil and dotted with the silent forms of Americans who never made the swim. Of the Marines who landed in the first wave, nearly 1 in 3 would never rise again. Official casualty reports would take weeks to finalize, but even the earliest estimates were staggering. Over 1,000 Marines killed, more than 2,000 wounded. The first amphibious assault against a fortified Japanese position had succeeded, but at a cost that shook the entire Pacific Command. General Holland Smith walked through the wreckage of the island with grim eyes, his uniform stained by dirt from foxholes he had crawled into during the worst of the fighting. When he paused near the seawall to stare at the reef, he understood how close they had come to defeat. Without intelligence from the swimmers, the landing craft would have struck that coral without warning, and the Marines would have hit the beach with even fewer survivors. The foothold might never have formed. The invasion might have drowned in the first hour. Instead, the 9 men who swam into darkness changed history. Lieutenant Thomas Tex James gathered his team along the pier, the same place where Japanese patrols had nearly spotted them only nights earlier. The pier was now pocked with bullet holes and streaked with soot, but it stood as a reminder of how intelligence won beneath the waves had shaped victory above them. James looked at the men who had followed him through every mission, their bodies battered and scarred, but their spirits unbroken. They had risked death 4 times in less than 2 days. They had swum through rifle fire, through corpses, through fear that gripped the chest and threatened to suffocate them. They had seen the cost of failure in the faces of Marines who struggled ashore with their last breath. And yet, every time the order came, they swam again. Commander officers now understood something that had never been written in training manuals. The first battle of an amphibious assault does not begin when the troops hit the shore. It begins when someone dares to enter the water ahead of them. Tarawa proved that truth in blood. James submitted a full report detailing their methods, challenges, and improvements needed. He recommended specialized teams trained exclusively for underwater reconnaissance and obstacle removal. Men equipped not only with depth poles and maps, but with explosives, diving masks, and the authority to shape landing plans with precise intelligence gathered in real time. The Navy listened. Within months, the underwater demolition teams, UDTS, were born. Their mission expanded well beyond measuring tides. They cleared mines from lagoon floors, destroyed anti-boat obstacles, and conducted stealth operations before every major landing that followed. Their work saved tens of thousands of American lives from Tarawa to Okinawa. In the decades to come, UDTS evolved again into SEAL teams, the Navy's most elite warriors, unmatched in covert insertion from the sea. Every SEAL who ever slipped beneath waves in darkness carried a lineage that began with 9 men at Tarawa. Their story did not end there. Williams returned home after the war and quietly carried his brother's memory, raising a family that he told every year about the Marines who didn't make it out of the surf. He never called himself a hero. He always said the real heroes were those who crossed the reef and kept going. Others from the team continued serving in UDT missions across the Pacific, using the lessons of Tarawa to guide them through the most dangerous waters of the war. Some remained in the Navy for decades. Some returned home and faded into lives of simplicity, never speaking much about the nights they spent swimming through death. Lieutenant James survived the war, though he rarely talked about Tarawa even to his closest friends. The reef haunted him. The sight of young Marines falling in the water replayed endlessly in his mind, long after the gunfire had faded into history. Yet every time a new amphibious operation succeeded with minimal casualties, he knew why. The cost he carried had become the reason others lived. Historians sometimes struggle to define what turned the tide of the Pacific War. They point to codebreakers at Midway, Marines on Peleliu, soldiers on Leyte, and the long, brutal climb to Iwo Jima. But there is a moment too small to make most textbooks, too silent to be captured in photographs, and too dark to be fully understood. It is the moment when 9 men slipped into the ocean and swam toward a fortress, knowing they might never return. No music marked their departure. No cameras recorded their courage. No cheers greeted their return. But every Marine who survived the first hour at Tarawa owed them a debt. Every successful U.S. landing that followed traced its roots back to their mission. The Navy kept their story mostly secret during the war, classified, tucked between pages of after-action reports. But Marines on Betio never forgot. They remembered the swimmers who stole the island's deadliest secret before the Japanese realized the war had arrived on their shore. When the American flag flew over Betio's ruins, it flew for the fallen, but it also flew for the 9 silent warriors who changed the battle before it began. For the men who measured life and death in inches of water. For the first generation of swimmers who proved that the deadliest missions are the ones no one sees. And for the legacy that endures every time a diver enters hostile water with nothing but courage and a mission. Tarawa is quiet now. Waves still crash against the reef that once stopped the landing craft. The pier still reaches into the lagoon, weathered but upright. The sun still sets in blood-red streaks across the sea, and beneath those waters lies the birthplace of a brotherhood of warriors who fight first, unseen, whose battles leave no footprints in the sand, whose victories are counted in those who live to reach the beach. The story of how 9 men stole an island lives on in every SEAL who rises from the waves, invisible until the moment victory is sealed.